Dreamscape presents The Shut-Eye by Belinda Bauer, narrated by Andrew Wincott.
Chapter 1. Valentine's Day, 2000. John Marvel looked at his watch. It was 8:37, and had done the same thing less than a minute earlier. He had promised Debbie he would be home by 9. Normally it wouldn't matter, but tonight it did, although he wasn't sure why. He felt the cold invade his lungs as he stared up into the dome of light that masked the stars. Frost hung in an ethereal ring around the street lamp, waiting to settle, and Marvel could feel it fingering his shins through the thin material of his trousers. He didn't like to be outdoors. It was too fresh. Even here, where London had sprawled south, overlapping the river and coating what used to be the Garden of England, with its grime and its traffic and its smell of decay. Marvel had started to sprawl with it. Too much home cooking. Too much home. Comfort had always made him restless. He needed to be always moving on, moving up, otherwise he got frustrated. Now he looked across the road to the King's Arms. It was filled with warmth and noise and booze. It had been more than a year since he'd been there, been drunk, and he still missed it like a lover, with a yearn in his chest and a dry lump in his throat. He wouldn't have gone in tonight, or any night. It was a test, a game he played with himself, driving past, slowing down, craning to look, not stopping. But tonight he'd stopped. He didn't know why. He was no more thirsty than on any other of the 400 days since he had had a drink. And then he'd seen the woman. And now it was hard to stand here, so near and yet so far. The pub's grubby stained-glass windows were lit from behind, like Christ in a cathedral, calling all sinners. Marvel checked his watch. It was 8:38. The second hand arced through the quadrant in a series of cheap jerks. "Look," he sighed, "are you gonna jump or not?" The woman on the ledge flinched, and her fingers pressed more tightly against the brick parapet. In the cold amber glow, Marvel could see the goosebumps stippling her skinny arms. She was wearing indoor clothes, a thin strappy top and skinny jeans, and those stupid little ballet shoes women wore nowadays instead of high heels. But then, she didn't strike him as a high heels kind of girl. She had a pinched, undernourished look to her face that made her cheekbones sharp and her eyes seem huge, but in a way that was less Audrey Hepburn, more eating disorder. Marvel guessed she was in her early 20s, but she could have been 17 or 40. She glanced at him and shrugged one bony shoulder in apology. I'm waiting for a train," she said. Then she looked back down between her shoes at the tracks. "Interesting," said Marvel with a sage nod of his head, as if she had explained everything. He stepped towards her and leaned briefly over the parapet to look at the glimmering rails. While he did, she gripped harder and watched him warily, as if he might suddenly lunge at her, grab her, pull her backwards over the wall to safety, heroically save her life. Despite his name, Marvel did no such thing. Instead, he gave a humorless grunt and said, "Then you're shit out of luck. The trains don't go through here after 8. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, without raising her head, she said, What time is it now?" Marvel lifted his watch again, tilting it so that the face was illuminated by the street light. 8:40. The girl nodded slowly at the tracks, her straggly brown hair veiling everything but her brow and the red tip of her nose. She wrinkled the brow and wiped the nose on the back of her hand. "Oh," she said, and Marvel could tell she was crying. Crying was not his thing, so he decided against words of comfort or a pat on the back, which might open some kind of emotional floodgate. He just stood there while she sobbed quietly. "I can't get anything right," she finally whispered. "Join the club," he snorted. She only shook her head slowly, apparently declining to join the ranks of any club that would have him as a member, even in her desperate state. "What's your name?" he said. She didn't tell him, and he didn't care, but he had to pretend. It was expected. Marvel wasn't going to keep the 9 o'clock promise. He was glad. Promises were traps, shackles to be broken. "I'll be home by 9. I'm not in the pub. I love you." The girl was still crying a little. He looked at his watch again. 8:43. "Come on," he said brusquely. "Hop back over and I'll take you home." She gave a long, shuddering sigh and nodded fractionally. "Okay." Marvel was a little surprised. That was easy. Too easy. His jaw clenched with annoyance. She had probably never meant to jump at all. He'd stood here in the freezing February night for almost 30 bloody minutes in full, tortuous view of the King's Arms, and the whole time she'd just been waiting for an opportunity to climb back over the wall. Time waster. His life was full of them, and they made him sick. Still, it had given him a good excuse to be late. Not that he'd really needed one. He often lied to Debbie about where he'd been and what he'd done, and it didn't change a thing. What could she say? In his line of work, you could make up any old bollocks and people had to believe you. Perk of the job. He put out a hand to steady the girl as she swung her legs over the parapet, but she swayed away from him, so he left her to it. She slid awkwardly off the wall and dropped onto the road beside him. She was almost a foot shorter than he was, and Marvel was no giant. She shivered and hugged her own arms for warmth. Before either of them could say anything, the 8:20 from London Victoria shook the bridge. They both stared down at the blurry black roof, blocking out the rails as it raced under their feet and through Bickley Station. In the silence that followed, the girl gave him an accusing look. But Detective Chief Inspector Marvel only shrugged. Chapter 2. "James!" James Buck was standing with a Golf GTI balanced on a single oily hand, like a waiter bringing a main course to a car crusher. He looked round at his boss. He hadn't heard him coming because the garage was always loud with engines and echoes and the radio playing, and because he'd been thinking, always thinking. About Daniel, of course. "What?" he said. "James!" yelled Brian Pigeon again. "Ang, turn that bloody thing down!" Ang went over to the radio, sulkily dragging his broom, and James lowered his arm. The car stayed up without his support, floating on the hydraulic lift, with its wheels dangling from their arches, like a puppy that's just been scooped off the floor. The music blared very slightly less loudly. "You did that timing on Mr. Knight's car?" Mr. Knight had a pristine Audi TT with a chrome Billy Boat exhaust. Last time they'd had it in, someone had scraped a wing, so if something else had gone wrong with the Audi, it was serious shit. James hadn't touched it on either occasion. Not that that made any difference. "What car?" he said blankly. "That one!" Brian shouted, and jabbed a finger at the garage forecourt. "The one dripping oil all over my new cement." James didn't look at the forecourt. He looked back up at the underside of the Golf and swallowed hard. He didn't trust himself to answer just yet. The cement wasn't that new. It had been poured exactly 4 months ago, on November the 5th. The morning of bonfire night. The morning Daniel had disappeared. He didn't expect Brian Pigeon to know that the way he knew it, but he still hated him for thinking of that day for any other reason. Brian was yelling again. "When you put the rocker cover back on, you must have pinched the gasket. Oil everywhere. All over Mr. Knight's driveway, too." James wouldn't have done something so careless. It was probably Mikey who'd pinched the gasket. He was rash and speedy, and if a car wasn't hooked up to the diagnostic computer, he was often lost. But James didn't say any of that. He just stood there, one hand at his side with a spanner dangling from it, the other over his head as he loosened the nut with his fingers, on autopilot now. "What have you got to say about that, then? Now the job has to be done again." "Not by you," Mr. Knight shouted from near the office. "You'll pay for someone else to fix it, or I'll sue the arse off you." Brian ignored that. "What have you got to say?" he demanded of James again. "Sorry," said James. "Sorry, bullshit," Brian shouted. "Mr. Knight is our most valuable customer. Now we have to do the job again." "You're not touching my car," Mr. Knight insisted. "For free," Brian kept on. "Even for free," said Mr. Knight. "I'm suing you." Brian ignored him again and shouted at James. "This is the last straw, James. Get out!" James let go of the golf and wiped his brow with his elbow. "What?" The spanner in his right hand suddenly felt very heavy. "Get your stuff and get out." Brian jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "You're fired." There was a brief silence, or what passed for it in the garage, with the radio still playing like static under their lives. "Hold on," said Mr. Knight, suddenly not so vehement. "I'm not... It's not—" Brian held up a hand. "Don't you worry, Mr. Knight. It's not your fault. Your custom is far too important for me to risk losing it over some moron." James felt the cold steel against the ball of his thumb. The spanner was beautifully machined and perfectly balanced. He tightened his grip. "Seems a bit steep, firing the guy," said Mr. Knight. "Not a bit of it," said Brian. "Messed up your car, messed up your driveway, messed up my forecourt, cost me a bloody fortune. But it's not about the money. We've got a reputation. We're professionals." Mr. Knight shrugged and nodded, slowly understanding that sometimes a man had to do what a man had to do. Brian turned back to look at James. "Are you still here? What are you waiting for, the gasket fairy?" James turned and with all his strength hurled the spanner across the workshop. It bounced off a bench, then skidded across the red-painted concrete floor of Pigeon's MOT and Diagnostics, and slid into the old inspection pit with a loud metal clang. James stormed around his boss. "That's a snap-on, you little shit," and past Mr. Knight. "Made a hell of a mess on my drive," and into the scummy little kitchen. He sat on the only chair with a padded seat, the one Brian always took. He put a foot on another of the chairs and pushed it noisily around the lino floor for a bit, and then kicked it over with a deliberate crash. There was a Formica table, a sink unit, the wooden bench where Ang slept, and 5 mismatched chairs. The table was covered with old newspapers and junk food wrappers, and a mug without a handle that Pavel and Mikey used as an ashtray. The walls were pitted and smeared with dark finger marks. Over the microwave was a calendar that was an excuse to hang photos of topless women on the wall. None of them ever looked at it or changed the month. It was just there as a minor male defiance. James tipped over another chair. All the time he heard indistinct voices under the usual echoing noises of pop music and of engines turning over. The voices became less and less heated. Brian talking to Mr. Knight walking away, the back and forth of departure. Then the courtesy car started up. James would have known it anywhere. It was a Citroen diesel that sounded like a suit of armor falling downstairs. Mr. Knight was leaving his Audi for the work to be done. After all that bluster and bullshit, that's the way it usually went. James listened to the Citroen bump off the garage forecourt and grind into second gear as it joined the traffic. Then he got up. He walked to the back of the workshop, but Ang was already retrieving the spanner from the layer of assorted rubbish in the bottom of the disused pit. Ang was quick to volunteer for anything, and Brian was not slow to take advantage of it. He put him to good use fetching sandwiches, parking cars, and dialing phone numbers for him, because he was too busy to waste time on hold. 3 years after arriving in England, on the axle of a flatbed truck, Ang was still learning the language. So far, he'd only really mastered the 4-lettered words. "Brian Pigeon calling. Please hold. You have message?" Ang practiced his lines endlessly under his breath. But the task was a minefield. Now Brian directed him from the edge of the pit, hands on hips, the poppers on his overalls starting to gape. James had noticed that lately, when Brian leaned into an engine bay, he had to find somewhere safe to rest his belly. He glanced at James. "Spanner was a bit much." "Sorry." Brian shrugged, then said, "Did you like the gasket fairy, though?" He laughed at himself, and then added a review. "Bloody hilarious." James smiled faintly, and put out a hand to help Ang up between the old ramp and the pit wall. He was slim, so he braced himself, but Ang was as light as a feather and seemed almost to float out of the pit. James followed Brian across the workshop to the office, while Ang picked up his broom and turned the radio up, singing along, putting the wrong words to the wrong tune. "Ang," shouted Mikey, "you sound like a randy cat." "Thank you," said Ang, and went on singing. He loved that radio. It was on in the morning when they arrived for work, and still on when they left every night. Brian looked up as James came into the office. "You don't mind, do you?" "No," said James. "So soon after?" Brian shrugged with his hands. "You know." "I don't mind," said James, and he meant it. He didn't mind about much anymore. Nothing was important enough to mind about. Brian took a crumple of notes from his pocket and tugged free a 20. "Here," he said. James tucked it into his top pocket without a word. "Shit," said Ang from the doorway. "Money for old nuts." "Rope," said James. "Money for old rope." "So what is money for nuts?" "I don't know. Peanuts, maybe. You get paid peanuts. Not much money, you know." "Oh," said Ang. "Okay." He hovered at the door. Brian was on the phone, sorting out another new lift. 4 years ago, when James had first started, they'd had 3 crappy old inspection pits. Now 2 had already been filled in and replaced by hydraulic lifts. There was also a rubberized floor and a new cement forecourt, and they still had to put the coffee against the microwave door to keep it shut. Brian was rich but tight. James figured maybe he was rich because he was tight. He shouted at someone about delivery slots and concrete setting times, then banged the phone down and shouted, "Arseholes!" Ang leaned into the office with his usual good timing. "I's fired for peanuts." "What?" said Brian. "I's fired, no James." "James gets fired." "But I's fired for peanuts." "James gets fired," Brian repeated. "He's white and English, so he gets fired. You're a Chinaman, so I can't fire you because that would be racist, see?" "Shit," Ang frowned. He toyed with the end of the broom handle, picking at the wood with his fingernail. Brian sighed. "Are you going to clean the floor, or am I going to have to call immigration?" Ang twitched upright and started sweeping. "I's Hmong person," he pointed out sulkily, "not Chinaman." "Well, now you're in England, and in England we work." Across the garage, Pavel gave a hollow laugh into the wheel arch of a Lexus. James reached up and continued undoing the nut on the Golf's exhaust clamp. It was the 13th time he'd been fired. 260 quid's worth of humiliation. Brian Pigeon was some actor. He should have been in the West End, not running a grubby MOT garage in South London. And his anger was convincing, even when you knew it was fake. Sometimes Mrs. Pigeon came to the garage, although she rarely got out of her sleek Mercedes. Just issued orders to Brian through the window, as if she were in a McDonald's drive-through. Brian never got angry with her, though. And sometimes James wondered whether that was why he had a reserve of that emotion, all locked and loaded and ready to direct at him whenever a customer looked like getting litigious. It always worked. Nothing appeased a rich bastard faster than seeing some grease monkey fired on the spot for screwing up a job. Nothing made them feel more important. It wasn't for real, but James still found it unpleasant. There was the embarrassment of publicly claiming a cock-up that was never his. There was the forced apology. There was the shouting and the submission and the spittle in the face. It all made him feel like shit. Even the 20 quid he got made him feel like shit. Brian always gave it to him as if he was doing him a big favor, singling him out for special treatment like a favorite son. "Jesus," said Brian Pigeon quietly. Hang stopped singing and stared sadly out of the double doors. James followed their gaze, and his heart sank even lower. His wife was out there, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the forecourt, like Buddha in a blue anorak. It only reminded him that feeling like shit was exactly what he deserved. Chapter 3. Anna Buck was crazy. Anyone could see. Every morning she sat in the street, not against the wall like a homeless person, but right in the way where commuters had to split around her with their phones and iPods plugged into their ears, and children circled her idly on their bikes like little Apaches. Once a day, come rain or shine, Anna opened the grubby front door in the Victorian terrace and edged outside. No sooner had she opened the door than she slipped through and closed it again, fast, checking behind her as if she were trying to keep a cat in the house. She always wore the same thing, a big blue waterproof, with sleeves that covered her right down to the fingertips. She kept her eyes down and the hood up, so that her face had an undersea pall. Head covered and bowed, Anna didn't need to look up to know exactly where she was going. Diagonally across the wide pavement and onto the cement of the garage forecourt. There she sank slowly to her knees and started to clean. Every day, Anna Buck brushed the cement with a toothbrush, wiped it down with a cloth, and then polished it to a gemstone shine. Nobody stopped. People were busy and had other places to be. If they looked, they just glanced, and only if they glanced again might they have noticed what it was that she was cleaning. 5 footprints in the cement. 5 little footprints leading away from the sooty houses to who knew where. Today was dry and the prints were dusty, and Anna used the toothbrush to clear the grit and dirt from the little rounded indentations where the toes had been. When the large pieces had been brushed away, she pressed her forefinger into the big toe print to lift away the dust. She thought of Daniel's toes, so small and pink and wiggly. This little piggy went to market. Pink and wiggly-giggly. She'd only had to start the rhyme to make him squirm with anticipation. His eyes made sparkling crescent slits by his chubby cheeks, and his small white teeth showing top and bottom with his squeals of laughter. Her finger fitted cosily into the next toe print. This little piggy stayed at home. She was still on the second toe. The tip of her forefinger fitted the second toe perfectly. all snug and cosy. "This little piggy stayed at home?" Daniel hadn't stayed at home. Daniel had gone, and he hadn't come back. No roast beef, no none, no wee all the way home. Just gone. Anna pressed her pinky into the third indentation, then the fourth. The fifth, the little toe, was too small even for her pinky, and she lowered herself like a supplicant to blow the dust from it, before wiping the rest of the footprint clean. Careful along the inner arch because Daniel was so ticklish, and then around the heel, dabbing the last of the dust out with the cloth. As she did, she could feel his heels in her hands again, cupping them in her palms during all those long-ago nappy changes, making his little legs pedal bicycles in the air as he giggled to the scent of talcum powder. He would laugh, and she would laugh, and James would laugh. It seemed impossible now, the very idea of laughter. "He'll be a sprinter. Look at those thighs. He'll be a dancer pointing his toes. He'll play for Spurs. What a kick!" Daniel had been easy to potty train. They said boys were harder than girls, but Daniel had been out of nappies by his 2nd birthday, and loved his big boy jeans and his Batman pants. He called them his Badman pants, and she and James had never corrected him because it was just so cute, and gave them a ridiculous level of pleasure every time he said it. Anna sobbed. It happened sometimes without notice, and she didn't try to stop it. She couldn't. Her tears were like breathing. There was no way of damming them. She tried in the early days, but it hadn't worked. Now she bent to her work and sobbed openly and didn't even care where she was or who saw her. One tear plopped into the footprint, and she cursed in her head and quickly soaked it up with the cloth. Salt and acid rain were death to cement and concrete. After she'd got all the soot and dirt out of the prints, she opened the wax and started to polish them, to protect them. Further up on the edge of the forecourt, someone called Big Mike had written his name in the same wet cement. But nobody had ever cared for Big Mike, and already the shallow letters were starting to wear and fade, the edges softened by rain and passing feet. That wasn't going to happen to Daniel's prince. Never. The fierceness of the thought stopped Anna's tears for a moment, and she wiped her nose on a blue sleeve and drew a deep new breath, enlivened by her own determination to keep her son's last known steps as fresh and clean as on the morning they were made, exactly 4 months ago. She couldn't stop people walking across them, not once she returned to the flat at least, but she could make them shine, and she did every day that it wasn't raining. When it was raining, she just came out and sat leaning over them for a while, head down, like a dying squaw, saving the footprints from wear for a short while, before hurrying back indoors, before the baby could wake up. At other times she placed a tea light there, and lit it with an old Bic lighter. Once a policeman blew it out, and told her it was a fire hazard. Anna had screamed in his face, some crazed incoherence about Daniel and wasting time and catching real criminals, and the policeman had backed off and scurried away. After that he walked his beat on the other side of the street and let her light her candles. Now Anna put out her finger and traced the outline of the last footprint. It was her favorite, the last point of contact Daniel had had with the ground. The print was twisted and a little misshapen, and more shallow than the others, as if he'd simply taken off and floated away, over the lime trees and into the sky. Beyond it, where the 6th print should have been, the cement was smooth and undented. "What are you doing?" Anna looked up briefly and saw a girl. She was in school uniform, black trousers, black shoes, and red sweatshirt, St. Catherine's Academy embroidered around a cross on the left side of the chest. Sometimes kids shouted at Anna as they went past in unruly groups, or called her names, weirdo and nutter and worse. She bent and went back to her work. "What are you doing?" the girl said again. It was weeks since Anna had spoken to anybody but James. Maybe months. She started, and then had to clear her throat of tears and disuse. "Cleaning." "Oh," said the girl. Anna polished the heel of the last footprint, making the cement as smooth and shiny as glass. While she rubbed, her anorex nylon hood scraped synthetically back and forth against her ears, cutting out everything else. Scree, scree, scree. Anna went on rubbing long after she knew the footprint was done, just to maintain that noisy silence. "Why?" said the girl. "What?" said Anna. "Why are you cleaning them?" "Because—" She stopped and thought, and then went on. "My son made them, and I don't want to lose them." "Why?" Daniel had wanted to know why, too, all the time. Why this, why that, why the other. It had driven her mad, although, of course, at the time she'd had no idea what mad was. Not the faintest idea. Now the lack of Daniel was showing her the true meaning of the word. Anna knew that. She knew she was going mad. But she didn't know how to stop it, any more than she knew how to stop crying or breathing. "Why?" The girl was still there, still asking, "Why don't you want to lose them?" Anna shrugged without looking up. "Because I lost him." "Really?" said the girl, and her forehead wrinkled with mystery. "How?" The how spun inside Anna's head so often that she knew it off by heart. The same way she'd once known every frame of Daniel's DVDs, The Lion King and Toy Story. She didn't want to replay the how, but once it had started, she could never stop it. She'd been in the kitchen, making packed lunches for play school and work. Peanut butter and carrots and a little chocolate bar shaped like a frog for Daniel. Peanut butter and a Mars bar for James. From the garage next door, the radio had gone on. The tinny sound of Duran Duran, maybe, or Culture Club, something from the 80s. She'd glanced through the kitchen window at the street below, beating out its own rhythms. The number 32 bus waiting at the stop. The man walking two rocking dachshunds. The woman jogging so slowly that the tall man with the Daily Telegraph under his arm overtook her with ease. The paving slabs cracking and tilting as the lime trees refused to be contained by concrete squares. There was a cement truck parked outside the garage, and the driver was laying thick, corrugated plastic pipes across the forecourt. In a minute, James would sneak up from behind and put his arms around her. "Oh!" She had turned her head and kissed him, long and hard. "I'll bring home the fireworks tonight," he'd said. She had laughed and said, "I bet you will." He had laughed too, and reached around her to pick up his lunch. Slowly, their bodies touching all the way down, smiling. "See you tonight." She'd see him a lot sooner than that, and never the same way again. Anna had heard him leave, heard him go down the narrow, dark stairs, heard him open the door. She hadn't heard the door shut. She hadn't even thought about it until afterwards, until it was far, far, far too late. James opened the door, James shut the door. That was what had happened every day for the 3 years they'd lived there. She knew it like Toy Story, so well that she could tune it out and have other thoughts, while it droned on in the background, unheard. "Daniel!" She'd taken out the chocolate and put in another carrot. "Daniel! Come on!" She'd taken out the carrot and put back the chocolate. She'd make cornflake cakes for tonight, Daniel's favorite. and she'd pick up some apples for bobbing on her way to work. She'd never go to work again. "Daniel!" She'd gone into his bedroom. She'd gone into the bathroom. She'd gone back to his room. She hadn't gone downstairs. There was no reason to. The only thing downstairs was the front door, and that was always shut because they were on a main road. Instead, she'd stood by the telly, wasting time, wasting life, wondering where he might be, and by the time she'd peered down the stairs, it was too late. 120 days ago, the door had been left open. Everything after that was just a fast-forward blur of panic, of running and shouting, and of the cement truck driver looking up from the fat, jiggling hose to see what was wrong, of Pavel and Mr. Pigeon scooting up and down the street, stopping strangers, holding their hands at hip height to show the top of Daniel's imaginary head, of Ang clutching his broom, wide-eyed and tearful at the commotion, of Mikey shouting, "Danny! Danny!" from the alleyway behind the garage, of James finally appearing from the direction of the shops, with an armful of sparklers and rockets that he then forgot about so completely that they dropped from his grasp one by one as he ran frantically up and down the street. All to the smell of fireworks in the dull air, and the sound of tinny hits floating from the garage. The first police car had pulled right up on the curb, and one of the coppers had found this place where 5 little footprints headed across the forecourt, and stopped. Nobody had seen him. Nobody saw him again after that bitter November morning. Anna didn't remember much more about that day, and didn't remember much about all the days since. The blur of police and cameras and newspaper stories growing smaller and smaller. DCI Lloyd calling now and then to pick her brains about things she might have remembered, just in case she had vital information that she hadn't bothered to share. The offers of medication and counseling, as if they could make her forget that Daniel was gone, as if that would be a good thing. Anna couldn't honestly have said how she'd got all the way from that day to this, how she'd survived, why she'd survived. The girl was still standing beside her. Anna gathered up the cloth and the toothbrush and the wax polish and got to her feet. Now that she was standing, she looked at the child's face properly. It was round and ruddy and about 8 years old. Black wire-rimmed glasses and dark brown plaits with hair clips shaped like flowers. "Where did he go?" the girl asked. And Anna realized that she must have thought all of those memories out loud. "Nobody knows," said Anna. And that truth sounded as brutal to her ears now as it had when she'd first overheard a policeman saying it to a concerned passerby on that fateful, careless day. "Did you look?" said the girl. "I've looked," she said. "We've all looked. We'll never stop looking." "Is he dead?" said the girl, with her eyes widening in horror. "No," said Anna firmly. "He's alive. Somewhere." The child nodded somberly, relieved to hear the good news. "If I see him, I'll tell you," she said, and Anna was touched. She tried to say thank you, but her mouth was too wobbly. She'd forgotten how sweet children could be. A week after Daniel had disappeared, somebody had pushed a tatty drawing through the front door. 2 goldfish in a pond. She guessed it was from one of his nursery classmates at Tigger time a few doors down. His teacher had knocked a few times too and offered comfort she had no real way to provide. Anna and the little girl with the pigtail stared down together at the 5 footprints, now so glossy and dark that they were like works of art in a fancy gallery. "They're all you've got left," the child said sadly. Anna nodded. They were all she had left. Then the girl said she had to go to school. And she disappeared, too. Chapter 4. The longer DCI John Marvel worked in homicide, the more he disliked people. He'd never met one he didn't hate, or despise at the very least. And he could see the bad in anyone. It was a useful quality in a detective, not so much in a human being. Murder was DCI Marvel's favorite thing in the whole world, even above Sky Sports. There was no other crime that had the sheer black-and-white finality of murder, and it was one of the few things in life he took personally. He was good at it, too. He had hunches and insights. He had the dogged obsession to keep going when everyone else had given up, not because he wanted to solve the crime, but because he hated to lose. Solving murders was a competition, make no bones about it. The killer won, or the cops won. How could you not love something that was so unambiguous, so biblical? Even when he used to go to the King's Arms of an evening, Marvel talked shop, as long as that shop sold murder. While his colleagues had tried to switch off and forget the underbelly, Marvel had mulled over the gory details. He mentally sifted evidence. He bullied colleagues into long, intricate discussions about blood spatter and rates of decay and dodgy evidence. And when they made excuses to leave early, he would sit alone and brood on the endless permutations of how and why and who and what and when. He took case files on holiday. While other men read Lee Child or Wilbur Smith, Marvel pored over autopsy reports and crime scene photos. And he got results. His solve rate since taking over Southeast's G-Team was a staggering 84%. He looked at his watch. It was exactly 5 minutes to opening time. Old habits died hard. He heaved himself out of his chair, went to the machine across the room and got a cup of tea. Or it could have been soup, it was hard to tell. Either way, he put 2 sugars in it. He took the cup back to his desk and lit a cigarette. The murder squad room at Lewisham was a low-ceilinged, overcrowded place, with every sharp corner softened by towers of bulging brown files. Computers the size of wheelbarrows pumped out heat and hum on each desk. But the paperless office was still the stuff of science fiction. At an outpost of this information Jenga, Marvel had annexed a corner desk by pulling rank on D.S. Brady. As soon as he'd secured the desk, Marvel had turned it to face the corner, where he taped a Reservoir Dogs poster and a selection of case file photos. Having his back to the room discouraged casual interaction. Marvel didn't give a shit what the rest of G-Team did behind his back, as long as they were still there when he turned around. He sipped his tea/soup and grimaced, then sucked hard on the Rothmans, loving the acrid warmth that filled his throat, and squinted at the photos on the wall. They weren't from the case he was working on now. That was about a 34-year-old prostitute called Tansy Anderson, who had been found in her wardrobe, with a lap full of her own skimpy clothing pulled from wire hangers, and a single bullet hole between her shocked eyes. Marvel had no doubt that very soon another whore would spill the beans and they would track down Tansy's pimp, who had coincidentally disappeared on the night she died, along with Tansy's money and heroin. It was a no-brainer. And if it didn't require a brain, it certainly didn't require photos on the wall to prick his memory. No. The photos John Marvel chose to look at every day were from an unsolved case. The case of Edie Evans, who had left home on her bike one dim January morning over a year ago, and had never arrived at school. For one long, tortuous, time-wasting day, Edie had been treated as a truant. She was almost a teenager. She was an adventurous child. She was on a bicycle. She knew how to catch a train to the city. The police did the maths, even though her parents insisted it didn't add up. Edie was young for her age, they said, by today's standards at least. She didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't wear makeup. She had a little brother she adored and a pet mouse called Peter. She was popular at school and good at her lessons, they said. Edie not going to school made no sense. Not coming home made even less. And they were right. Just before dark, a man walking his dog had found Edie's bicycle under a giant rhododendron on a stretch of green alongside the road. Its back wheel buckled, folded almost in half, and its chain hanging in a sad loop. That's when Edie Evans became a missing person. And early the next day, when a few drops of what proved to be Edie's blood were found on the pavement that ran between the green and the road, the case was turned over to the murder team. It was only logical, although they'd never found a body and probably never would now. Marvel tapped his cigarette against the edge of an ashtray shaped like a pair of lungs, then sighed at the photo through twin jets of smoke. He knew Edie's face better than he knew anyone's, apart from his own and the Queen's. Edie was a slightly goofy-looking child, with teeth she'd never grow into now, a sprinkling of summer freckles, and bobbed brown hair caught behind one sticky-out ear. In the photo she was standing astride a BMX bicycle in jeans and a Simpsons t-shirt, looking slightly upwards into the camera, with a determined expression on her face. "We call that her space face," her mother had told Marvel with a sad little laugh. "She wants to go into space." He had wanted to go into space. Marvel had forgotten it until the very moment Edie's mother had handed him the photo, but remembering it had brought a wash of memories that had left him glowing with long-lost happiness. Sneaking into the Stone Merchants on Abigail Road with his best friend Terry Stubbs, to make an ascent of the giant grey gravel mountain at the back of the yard. The favoured west face, to avoid being seen by the old man in the caravan-come office, and moving ponderously to show they were on the moon and lacked gravity. In the dirty, overstuffed city, the harsh gravel, made pale by the elements, was the closest landscape they could find to what they'd seen on grainy black-and-white TV. The winner was the one who could plant his flag closest to the summit without being seen. Although they didn't have flags, Terry's was a spatula, and his own was a plastic sword with rubies on the hilt. Sitting in the Evanses' suburban front room, John Marvel had once more been able to feel the hot gravel under his belly, and the betrayal of sharp stones clicking down the slope behind him like unlucky dice. They'd been chased a few times, but never been caught. Not there, at least. Not on the moon. They'd played in the stone yard tirelessly until they'd grown tired of it and never went back. Later he'd wanted to be a bus driver, then a scientist, then a fireman. He couldn't remember ever wanting to be a detective. But there you go, and here he was. Another day, another game. It had been years, decades since he'd thought of Terry Stubbs and the moon, and it had given him a strange, syrupy feeling that anyone else would have quickly identified as sentiment. After showing him the photo, Edie's mother and father had shown him Edie's bedroom. As soon as he'd walked in, Marvel had known that she'd been taken just as surely as they had known, from the very moment that they'd realized she was missing. Edie Evans was going places, but not up to Oxford Street for a day out shoplifting mascara with a gang of girlfriends. The walls of her room were completely covered with posters, not of pop singers and celebrities, but of real stars. There were planets and star maps and rockets and spaceships. Captain Kirk on one wall, Han Solo on another, Neil Armstrong on the back of the door, a space shuttle landing, and an Apollo mission taking off, robots and stormtroopers and willowy aliens with slanted black eyes. Between the big posters and pictures were cuttings and clippings, and cartoons of constellations and close encounters, filling the gaps like grout. Even the ceiling was dotted with the pale green stick-on stars that Marvel knew would suck up the sun and then glow in the dark over a child's head. Marvel looked out of the window and into the mouse's cage. One looked over the neatly tended back garden to the trees beyond. The other was filled with curly wood shavings and old cardboard toilet roll tubes, nibbled at either end. The mouse, Peter, pattered along in his wire wheel, going nowhere at a fair old lick. Marvel had worked deep into every night in his efforts to find Edie. He had asked to have the case kept open long after it had started to chill. He had tried everything, even a psychic. He hadn't consulted one, of course. That would have been the ultimate admission of failure. But when D.S. Short had suggested it, Marvel had only laughed derisively in her face, not forbidden it outright. And when the expense request came in, he had signed it, comforting himself with the thought that it said it was for church roof donations. Nothing wrong with denial. Marvel had only seen the psychic once, briefly and on TV, talking earnestly about his efforts to help. Help schmelp. Marvel might as well have consulted the tea-leaf/rehydrated noodles in the bottom of his cup of tea/soup. All the psychic had done was bring the weirdos and well-wishers out of the woodwork. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. Marvel wasn't sure there was one. Mark and Carrie Evans had been inundated with letters and trinkets from around the world. Visionaries, kindred spirits, children, all sending hope and Bible verses and talismans and charms. There was even money, $20 Australian miraculously still stapled to a postcard from Perth, £100 in dirty notes stuffed into an ornately decorated envelope, and a crisp 50 with a long letter detailing another child missing in another place. As if money would help. There were the sickos, too. There were always a few who trawled the papers for vulnerable targets, and reached out in their own repulsive way. 3 Polaroids of a man's erect penis, a jewelry box containing a turd, and a newspaper photo of Edie with the eyes cut out and scrawled with the words, "I killed your girl." The world was full of wankers, including the so-called psychic, who'd had woolly visions for a few weeks before the trail had gone cold. Marvel had been so angry that he'd been to see Superintendent Jeffries about getting their money back. But Jeffries hadn't wanted to risk dragging their embarrassing experiment through the courts. A lesson learned, he had said. Marvel took another hard drag of his cigarette and felt the heat warm his thumb and finger. The only tangible clue they'd had in the case was Edie Evans's bicycle. It had been found half-hidden under the rhododendrons on the broad strip of green that lay between the Evanses' home and the school. Marvel had been there more than once, more than 50 times. It was a half-wooded, half-grassed area where local people walked their dogs and children played hide-and-seek. In the summer, parents could sit outside the pub across the road and watch their kids kick a ball about. Safe. Not safe. The line was so fine. Marvel had never met Edie, but he had met her bicycle. The BMX was propped against a wall in the evidence room downstairs right now, still bent and drooping. It was an old, cheap bike and had been hand-painted in broad black and white hoops. "Like a rocket," her father had said, looking at the photo in her room. "We painted it together." "Did it have a bell?" Marvel had asked. "Not that I remember. Why?" "There are some scratches on the handlebars where a bell would go, but there's no bell in this picture." Her father had shrugged. "It's an old bike. It had lots of scratches." It looked mildly puzzled. Not puzzled about the bell, but puzzled about why it even mattered, when his daughter was gone and there was blood on the pavement. It didn't matter, so Marvel hadn't pressed the point. He'd noticed it, that was all. It was his job to notice things, but sometimes the things he noticed weren't meaningful or logical, weren't things you could put in a report and call evidence. Sometimes they were just things, but he noticed them all the same. Not that it had helped. The case had gone cold, the mystery remained unsolved. Edie remained lost, and the world moved on without her. But still she watched him from the wall above his desk, as determined now as she had been on the day he'd caught the case. How could Marvel be anything but equally devoted to the mystery of her disappearance? Somebody, somewhere, knew what had happened to her. All he had to do was find that person. It seemed a very simple task when he looked at it like that, not something he could just give up on, not rocket science. Along with fresh air and roughage, Marvel thought that children were overrated, but he had a soft spot for Edie Evans. Chapter 5. The door was open. Anna woke in a panic, already half out of bed. "Is that the baby?" "No." "I think it's the baby." "Don't get up." "But don't get up," said James. "Lie down." She did, turning on her side away from him so he couldn't watch her creased brow, concentrating on listening for the smallest sound. Behind her, she could feel James thinking, feel him wanting to say something, anything. She waited and waited and waited and waited. Then she got up to go to see to the baby, just as they'd both known she would. Once the thought was in her head, it must be completed, and once completed, it would be repeated. Endlessly? Behind her, James got up and went to work. Anna didn't go to work anymore. She used to work for a company that made packaging for makeup. Not on the factory floor, but in the office. At a desk, under her 60 words per minute typing diploma, slender fingers flashing. Now those same fingers were red and chapped from when she cleaned the flat, and cleaned the flat, and cleaned the flat. Anna cleaned the flat on a loop, like the Fourth Bridge. It wasn't a big flat, but it was in an old house, and it didn't stay clean for long, or not as clean as she needed it to be. There were 2 bedrooms, a bathroom and toilet, a living room and a kitchen, and every single room was full of germs. Full of germs. Anna could hear germs breeding on countertops and under sofa cushions. They filled her mouth when she yawned and gritted her lids when she blinked. She bleached the kitchen counters 5 times a day. She changed the baby even though he hadn't dirtied his nappy. And every item in the fridge was wrapped so tightly in plastic film that it took her 4 minutes to crack an egg. Charlie was not allowed on the floor, and Anna kept antibacterial wipes in her jeans pocket. 20 times a day, she got up from the table, out of her bed, out of the shower, just to swab his fingers and face. When Daniel came home, he would be so safe. Nothing would ever harm him again, not a cough or a cold, not a stubbed toe or a paper cut, not nits. She often started cleaning before she got dressed, scrubbing the paintwork around the doors and bleaching the mugs. She swept James out of the front door every morning and then covered his tile tracks with cream cleaner followed by polish, running a cotton wool bud against the bottom of the skirting to be sure she was getting right up to the edges. She had James buy a fold-away 3-step ladder and scrubbed her way around the ceilings in concentric rings, coaxing Daddy Longlegs into jars and releasing them through the kitchen window. James did everything else that required leaving the flat. Work, shopping, errands, and he always returned. The smell of him alone could make Anna panic. That dark, oily reek of the garage that kept her away from it like garlic does a vampire. Sometimes she could smell it seeping through the walls along with the tinny music, despite the pine and the lemon and the lavender that she lavished on every surface. James always took off his steel-toed boots at the bottom of the stairs, but he refused to remove his overalls. "I'm not taking off my clothes to come in my own bloody house," he'd say. "Not your clothes, just your overalls," Anna said anxiously. But he wouldn't, even though it was all his fault. All of it. So every night James led his smell up the stairs and across the kitchen to the sink, where Anna had already run a steaming bowl of soapy water and put out a pot of swarfiga and a nail brush for him to wash his filthy, black-grained hands and wrists, right up to the elbows. It was there, at the sink, that he would strip off his overalls so that she could bear them the 3 paces to the machine. She didn't start it immediately. First, she had to wait for him to finish washing, so that she could swab down the sink and the counter and the floor where he'd been standing, and then she could wash that cloth too. 2 biological tablets and a boil wash every night. Their electric and water bills matched those of a family of 6, although it was only them. And always would be, now that she wouldn't let him touch her any more. Not with those hands he scrubbed so hard but were never really clean. Anna shuddered. Then she looked up from washing the dishes and cocked her head. She thought she'd heard Charlie crying. Not hard, more of a whimper. That was worse. Crying would show he had a healthy pair of lungs, while a whimper and then silence filled her with dread. Some noises might be the children out behind the Tigger-Time play school a few doors down, but this sounded inside. There it was again. She removed her hands from the water and splashed Dettol liberally over them. A fresh towel was employed for drying before she hurried into the nursery, or the bedroom. It depended on who was talking. By the time she got there, the baby had gone back to sleep. Anna breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, as she pulled the soft lemon blanket over one adventurous leg. "Have you been kicking, you little monkey? Have you been dancing? Charlie's golden lashes were laid on his peach cheeks. One wrinkled fist curled beside his ear. She laid a soft hand on his chest, and his heart fluttered like a baby bird under his white toweling pajamas. Anna closed her eyes, and for a brief, precious moment, everything was all right. Then the letterbox clattered and the circle started again. The letterbox was in the door that was open. Anna went slowly downstairs, bills and junk all over the mat. The bills she opened but didn't read. Everything else she folded neatly 3 times. If she didn't, the kitchen bin would soon be full, and her panic rose with its contents. She had spoken to the postman about the junk mail, but he'd explained that he got extra for delivering it. "Why?" she'd asked. "So I can carry it from the door to the bin?" He'd only shrugged, and at Christmas Anna hadn't tipped him, even though he'd knocked on the door on the pretext of handing her a small package that would certainly have fitted through the slot. 2-for-1 pizza with free garlic bread. Fold. Release the cash in your home. Fold. £1,000 could be yours in 10 minutes. Fold. The dead are waiting to speak to you. Anna stared at the leaflet. It was not glossy like the others, just cheap white paper and black ink. But somehow that, and the lack of an exclamation mark, made it seem more honest, made it seem that speaking to the dead was a more believable offer than free money and double pizza. The dead were waiting to speak to her. Anna swayed a little and touched the banister for support. Daniel's not dead. She'd been telling herself that for 4 months. Daniel's not dead. At first, it had been a blind belief. Then a crazy hope. Then a desperate marginal faith that made other people avoid her fevered gaze and nodded their own feet when she insisted it was a fact, as if she'd joined the Moonies. Eventually the words had started to sound meaningless, even inside her own head. Daniel's not dead. Daniel. Anna folded the leaflet once, folded it twice. Slowly she unfolded it again. The dead are waiting to speak to you. Mediumship and open circle, £2. Private consultations with the dead by Richard Latham, as seen on TV. Why not come along and join us at Bickley Spiritualist Church, Fridays, 7 p.m. Free tea and biscuits. All welcome. Anna touched the words, as if she could glean more meaning through her fingertips than through her eyes. She wasn't stupid. She guessed that free tea and biscuits was a sign of desperation on the part of the church, not generosity. And yet, somehow, they tempted her. She imagined dunking free biscuits into free tea, while someone who'd been seen on TV gave her all the answers to every question. Daniel's not dead, she told herself fiercely. I would feel it. I would know. Except that she didn't know. Feeling and knowing were two different things, and not knowing was the rat that gnawed at her heart in the dark, early hours of the morning, before the buses started to rumble. Was he cold? Was he hungry? Scared? Was somebody hurting him? Did he miss her? Did he wonder where she was and why she wasn't coming to get him? Did he think she didn't love him anymore? That last thought was the worst, and had the power to make her twist in physical pain. On Bickley Bridge she'd planned an end to the daily torture of not knowing, and only the lies of a passing stranger had saved her. But saved her for what? For more pain, for more guilt, for more agony? She stared at the flyer. If she'd been prepared to end her torture that irreversibly, wasn't this worth trying? Wouldn't it bring some kind of relief to know something? Even if that something was that Daniel really was dead. For the first time since he had disappeared, the thought did not bring tears tingling into her eyes, only a deep, dull ache in her chest. The dead are waiting to speak to you. Anna felt the words tugging at her in an insistent and seductive undertow. Quickly she folded the leaflet again, once, twice, 3 times, and put it with the other junk mail. Then she pushed the whole bundle so far down into the kitchen bin that she had to scrub her arm with Dettol.